Good morning, everybody. Can everyone hear okay? Put your thumb up. Yeah, okay, thank you. So this morning's theme is dealing with dangerous distractions. If you're anything like me, when you read the Bible, and when I read the Bible, if I'm dipping into the middle of a book or a theme within the Bible, I sometimes get a bit muddled what came before and where are we going. So I thought I'd have a quick look at the story of Nehemiah so far. So the people of God lived in a walled city, which was Jerusalem. I've never been to Jerusalem, and in any case, this would be the new Jerusalem that would be there now, not the one that we're talking about in Nehemiah. But it probably had fortresses. It probably had it had big, thick walls and massive, big doors to stop the enemies getting at God's people. But God told the people that if they didn't follow him more closely, they'd be taken captive by the Babylonians. Now, that seemed an unlikely thing, and the people probably scorned and scoffed a bit and said, nah, it isn't going to happen. He wouldn't do that. But guess what? They didn't listen, and it did happen. And Jerusalem was razed to the ground. The walls were destroyed. The gates were set on fire and destroyed. And the people were taken into captivity in Babylon, which has been said previously, was about between 800 and 900 miles away. The unthinkable had happened to God's people. The good news for you and me is that God is merciful. And eventually the people were returned in small groups back into Jerusalem. The problem was that its walls and its gates had been pulled down, and therefore the people would be really vulnerable to attack from their enemies. So here's some more good news. God called a man called Nehemiah to rebuild the walls. Now, the interesting thing about Nehemiah is that he was a wine waiter to the king. Now, I don't know about you, but if I were going to employ somebody to rebuild a city wall and gates, I probably wouldn't choose a wine waiter. I'd probably choose builders and surveyors and somebody that I thought might know what they're doing. But you know, in God's wisdom, God chooses the people that he chooses. And that's great encouragement for you and me today, that God chooses the people that he calls to be faithful. Great hope. So in chapter 6 of Nehemiah, the walls were being rebuilt, but not the gates. Also, Nehemiah had been under threat from his enemies. How we dealt with this is further hope for us. Sooner or later, along the Christian journey, we're going to come across all manner of obstacles. And sometimes those obstacles seem just too much for us. But it's interesting how Nehemiah dealt with those obstructions and obstacles to what God had called him to do. In verses 1 to 4, there is a plot to harm Nehemiah. I have to say, Lynette, you did a marvelous job with all those names. And I'm speaking on that chapter, I wasn't quite sure how to pronounce some of those names, so you did a great job. But Nehemiah's enemies tried to lure him into the middle of nowhere for a spurious business meeting. To me, it's bizarre, isn't it? These enemies wanted to stop Nehemiah at all cost from rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. They wanted to stop and spoil God's purposes and God's plans. And so they made up this story and said to Nehemiah, Nehemiah, shall we have a business meeting? It's very important that we have a business meeting. Oh, says Nehemiah, where shall we have it? Shall we have it down in Costco where I can nip in? Sorry, Costa. It's so long since I've been to Costa. Shall I nip into Costa and we'll have the business meeting? No, said the enemies of God and enemies of Nehemiah. We know this super little village in the middle of nowhere. That sounds a good place to have a business meeting. But you know, Nehemiah wasn't stupid and he was on their case. But his response is quite encouraging and challenging. And he says, they were scheming to harm me. So Nehemiah knew that they were up to no good. But you know what? He didn't let these spurious enemies thwart God's purposes. He was resolute in his desire to finish the task that God had called him to do. And he totally ignored the spurious business meeting, however attractive it might have seemed, and focused on what God wanted. And there's a challenge there for us, isn't there? Sometimes we get distracted. And when we're doing God's work and trying to do God's work, we can be distracted. And when we're distracted, we can move our focus. But Nehemiah is a challenge and an encouragement to us. Focus on what God wanted. And he carried on rebuilding the gates and the walls. Now there's a second distraction, and that was a plot to undermine Nehemiah. Now, some of us might have ignored the spurious business meeting, and we might have known that they were up to no good. But when people start trying to undermine who you are and what you are, that can really cut into the heart, can't it? So Nehemiah's enemies made up lies about him. And they said that he was trying to plot a revolt and even try to become a king. Well, of course, nothing was further from the truth. He was a wine waiter who was going to rebuild the walls and gates of Jerusalem because God had called him. And you know, it's not easy sometimes to handle unjust accusations. And I can honestly say to my shame that over my 38 years of Church of England ministry, there have been times when I haven't handled unjust accusations. And I've kind of fought back and even shouted back occasionally. But in verse 9, Nehemiah's response to these false accusations, I think, is brilliant. And in verse 9, he said, but I prayed. I prayed. Nehemiah, his response to all these false accusations is not to start coming back with a load of mouth, but it's to pray. I'll give you a very quick illustration on that one. While I was preparing this a week or so back, we had a couple of issues within the family that were taking away our focus a little bit. And we were struggling to work out what to do. And the danger when we're facing these difficulties is that we focus on the difficulty and then we get sidetracked and then we start worrying and then we start all manner of things that are unhelpful. And as we were going through that situation, I read this verse 9, but I prayed. And I actually said to Linda, do you know, we don't need to fret and worry about this situation. Nehemiah prayed. And so we did. And you know what? They often say in the Alpha course, Nicky Gumbel on the Alpha course often says that you can rule out coincidences. And the situation turned itself round. We were amazed. We shouldn't be, but we were amazed. But even more amazing is what Nehemiah prays. He didn't pray, oh God, send away these accusations, send away these people that are having a go at me. He prayed, strengthen my hands. He was asking God to help him to do an even better job than he was doing. He was in effect saying, bless these hands, oh God. So Nehemiah prayed. He didn't pray, get me out of here. He prayed, help me to do the job. So that was another distraction. And then there's another distraction in verses 10 to 14. It's a plot to make Nehemiah feel got at. And that's sure to get right through again to the heart. Nehemiah calls in to see a friend. Now you'd think he'd be fairly safe calling in to see this friend, the prophet Shemaiah. But this friend wasn't the friend that Nehemiah hoped he was. And he starts to warn Nehemiah of danger. Well, Nehemiah knew this guy was a prophet, so Nehemiah might have thought, prophets do warn you of danger. But then this prophet tells him to hide in the temple. Now, only priests were allowed in the temple. Nehemiah was a wine waiter, not a priest. So he shouldn't have been in the temple. And in fact, he didn't go in the temple. And it would have been bad for him to be in the temple. So Nehemiah twigged that something not right was going on, whether God gave him discernment, but he twigged that something not right was going on. And he refused to give in to fear of all these threats. And he wouldn't hide in the temple. So Nehemiah had nowhere to hide, but he trusted in God. And God saw him through. And despite the work of Nehemiah's enemies and all these personal plots against him, in verse 15, it's a brilliant little verse, isn't it? The wall was completed in 52 days. You see, God had fulfilled his purposes. Nehemiah had proven faithful to his God. And despite the dangerous distractions that could have led him here and there and all over the place, Nehemiah was resolute and focused on serving his God. And I believe that chapter 6 of Nehemiah is a challenge to focus on what God calls us to do and not to be thrown off center and out of purpose by these distractions that we will find that there are distractions. As a Christian, you will find there are distractions. The passage shows us the subtlety of the enemy, but it also shows us the sufficiency of God. And it's important that we learn to focus on the sufficiency of God rather than the subtlety of the enemy. And as Nehemiah focuses on the task before him, God gives him the strength and the wisdom to continue. Angela, the other week when she preached on the earlier chapter of Nehemiah, mentioned that the devil prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. I do like National Geographic on Sky, and I do watch a number of animal programs. And occasionally there are animal programs about lions, and it'll show a pride of lions stalking their next meal. And they don't just go up and gobble an innocent looking antelope. They prowl around and they move around strategically and carefully. So the devil prowls around, scripture says, like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Anybody that's vulnerable, anybody that perhaps at that moment isn't feeling all that good about God, anybody that's getting bitter and twisted and angry, those are like little stepping points for the enemy to get a grip. So let's not focus on the dangerous distractions. Nehemiah is focused and he trusts in God. Nehemiah prays for God's help to continue. He doesn't pray that the problems will go away. He prays for God's help in the middle of the problems. Nehemiah wouldn't give in to fear. And God's plans to rebuild Jerusalem are completed because of Nehemiah's continued faithfulness to God. Amen.